Here comes Okay. We're going to start our meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, October 26, 2021. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Are there any changes to it?
No changes from staff.
Okay. Then second item is the chair's report, of which I have nothing to report tonight. And item 3 is director's report.
Very briefly, you're going to see tonight, we're going to talk about some stuff that I've been taking a deep dive on for the past few weeks. But really, since we saw you last, a lot of our time and attention has gone into welcoming about 200 planners from across northern New England and into southern New England for a regional planning conference in Burlington last week. Time all runs together. But it was really fun to kind of have a bunch of people here and kind of share some of the great work that's gone on here in Burlington over the last many years. We got lots of very positive kudos for our work and for our city and for our conference. So that was a good win. And I know I speak for Megan when I say that we're both really glad it's over.
Well, nice job hosting it here. Was there anything else to add, or is that?
That's it for me. Megan,
Good.
you have anything to add?
Yeah, I have one thing, if you can hear me okay.
Yes.
The Council Ordinance Committee met last week, and one of the items that was on their agenda was the parking amendment that Councilor Hanson introduced a few weeks ago. I think David has mentioned previously that Councilor Hanson introduced an amendment to eliminate the minimum parking requirement citywide and to expand the TDM requirement from our downtown and multimodal mixed use district into other areas of the city. So I attended their meeting last week just to talk about what the process would look like. And I think the short answer is that Councilor Hanson is really interested in working on this primarily at the city council level, but is going to work with me to help schedule a joint meeting between you all and the Council Ordinance Committee. Kind of instead of them being invited to your meeting, it would be you invited to their meeting for a little bit of a change in the process. But ultimately, I think he's interested in kind of moving pretty quickly on considering this draft amendment. Ultimately, it would still come back to the Planning Commission when the City Council is done considering it to do the kind of required statutory review, correction of any technical deficiencies, and to hold a public hearing before they could take any action on it. So you will definitely see it as well when they're done working on it. But just wanted to share with you that I'll be reaching out to you soon to find a date that we can coordinate a joint meeting for you to talk with the Council Ordinance Committee about that amendment.
Great. Thank you.
And that reminds me that last night, the council gave final approval to 3 amendments that have been through the commission. This was 21-7 having to do with height measurements, 21-8 having to do with changes relative to Act 179, and 21-9, which were updates to Article 14, the form-based code. So those are all unanimously approved by the council last night. I think outstanding, we still have the short-term rental amendment that's before the Council Ordinance Committee.
And I'll be going to their meeting tomorrow night to talk to them about that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll close out that item and move on to item 4, which is public forum. Megan, is there anybody here for public forum?
Yes, there are several people. I see Scott Mapes. You should be able to speak. Unmute yourself.
Yes.
Hi, Scott, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I've been asked by Rick Davis to offer some comments regarding your discussion of changing the enterprise zone to include the residential use. Rick, as you know, is a controlling owner of 453 and 501 Pine and is in support of a zoning change to allow residential uses in this zone. Some of you may recall that in 2013 to 2015, these parcels were subject to a DEC Brownsfield Economic Recovery Alliance process, which identified that there are extraordinary costs associated with developing these parcels, in part due to environmental issues associated with the Barge Canal Superfund site and complying with the EPA's Record of Decision institutional controls. These extra costs will likely preclude any development at the site for some time, unless there's grant funding available to mitigate these costs. Just recently, the state made grant funding available to brownfields. However, these funds are limited, and the goal, as expressed by DEC, is to use them sooner rather than later. A developer must apply for these funds while submitting a corrective action plan, which is typically associated with developing a brownfield. As a matter of timing critical to this site, unless a developer applies for these funds in the next 4 to 6 months, the funds will likely be dedicated to other brownfield sites in Vermont. DEC has confirmed that a CAP must include a development plan which identifies the ultimate use for the site. If the use is to be residential, a developer needs to know that is allowable prior to submitting a corrective action plan. It is unlikely this site will be developed for commercial use anytime soon, as there's a diminished market for commercial space following the pandemic. There is a real need for housing, and it is our belief that if residential use is allowed in the enterprise zone, the property becomes very attractive to developers. We believe allowing residential use in the enterprise zone is an economic development tool and a way to create jobs and attract workers to Burlington. People want to live near where they work, and in some instances, to be able to work where they live. We understand and respect the process and the decision the Planning Commission must go through to make a zoning change, but we want you aware of these factors, especially in regards to the timeliness of available grant funds that are critical to seeing this property developed. Rick would have shared this with you directly. He's away, but he asked that I bring these factors to your attention as you consider entertaining a zoning change. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Megan, anybody else?
Yes, we have Jeff Nick.
Hi, Jeff. Welcome.
Hello. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks for this opportunity. And thanks, Megan, for letting me in. I just notified her about an hour ago. But I was asked to speak to the Planning Commission about our situation with the Midtown Motel site. Myself and my partner, Dan Morrissey, and I'll just kind of walk you through a history of where we've been and where we're at today with that site. My partner and I, Dan Morrissey, bought this about 25 years ago when we were young and naive. Of course, now we're old and frustrated. And we've had many opportunities through the years with REI. Target wanted to do a 2-story building. Hotel operators have always been interested. We looked at it very seriously with UVM's interest in a combined hockey, basketball, and special events arena. And now we have Burlington High School looking at it as a possible site. All these sites or all these ideas required a significant parking component, which is one of the reasons I guess the city hasn't been too attracted to this development idea. But of course, the parking would double as public parking and relieve the pressure within the downtown core and allowing the pedestrian, be much more pedestrian friendly, as you would capture the cars here and everybody would walk to Church Street. But that aside, we've always looked at this site as saying, well, we really didn't want to develop it as our property alone. It really had we had a grander vision. And I think the community deserves it with, Memorial Auditorium in question and what could be done here in the long term. But in the short term, we were faced with a situation where that motel building, the roof failed, and we had photographs showing that the roof failed. And this is not a roof that you just patch. You would have to replace the whole thing, and the cost was over $30,000. So we approached the city and figured we'd be welcome to ask for a demolition permit. I kind of thought we would walk in and receive the permit that next day, but that wasn't the case. We were asked if we had and this is where it gets quite cumbersome, the process. We had to go through a number of hoops here. We were asked about a replacement project, and we said, of course, we don't have a replacement project. We're looking at the grander vision and do something in partnership with the city. The staff also threatened legal action at one point, claiming that we were causing demolition by neglect and due to the leaking roof. And that wasn't the case. We're not neglecting the building, but it just got old. And I pointed out that if there's claiming demolition by neglect, we could also say that Memorial Auditorium is demolition by neglect. So of course, that argument quickly went away. But in order to demo that Midtown without a replacement project, then we had to go to the state historic board and prove to the state that it was not worthy, this building, of consideration to be on the historic register. We prevailed, surprisingly, by only a vote of 3-2, and at a cost of $3,500 in consultants' fees. We also, along the way, had to hire an engineer to kind of prove to the city that it was really needed to be torn down because it was in really bad shape. Then the really frustrating part was our idea was to remove the building, landscape the front, and retain the parking. And we were told that that would be a change of use, surprisingly enough, from structured parking with the building over the parking to surface parking. And we thought that was really a stretch in the definition because we had a permit from 1986 for the gelato, if everybody remembers this, and some of you do, the gelato stand that was in the front of the motel. We had a permit that recognized the existing leased parking to a law firm during the day and allowed the motel guests to use it at night. So that was in writing from the city in 1986. And of course, we've been informed by our attorney that the Supreme Court has ruled that these uses that have existed for 15 years or more without notice from the city prevail, that we're allowed to keep the parking. And so we've been at this for a long time. And of course, everybody knows this parking lot's situated between a metered parking lot, a leased parking from the city, firehouse parking, library parking, church parking. It's not a change of use. It's all the same area there. So our permit that we had to obtain to demo the building requires us to grass in the existing parking and landscape the front, retaining an area to get to the rear of the other building, that duplex that we also own. But now in light, what we realize is what's going to happen if we do grass this in, it'll likely become a homeless encampment. And I think you can all agree that since Sears Lane is being demoed, there are already homeless people sleeping under the steps at Memorial Auditorium and also in an unregistered car behind the library currently. So we're very frustrated. We're being threatened with fines by the city of $75 per day per vehicle. But if we do grass it in, we're going to end up with most likely an encampment. And it's just extremely frustrating that nobody thinks these things through, and the DRB, we're going to go back to the DRB and see, if we can get some relief there. I just thought the Planning Commission should know what we've been through, and with something that I think should have been welcomed, the removal of a graffiti-ridden hotel should have been welcomed. And, despite the fact that we still believe this whole block should be developed, in concert with the city land, we could easily develop this project as a 70-unit building on our own land. And I don't think long-term it's beneficial for the community, but, we're old and frustrated, and we just might end up doing a 70-unit project there. It would be unfortunate, but I think that's what we're faced with if all this continues. But anyway, thanks for your time and listening, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for sharing that with us. Megan, is there anybody else?
Yes, Sharon Busher.
Sharon, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. I just wanted to speak about Councillor Hanson's request to deal with TDM and eliminate minimum parking requirements and the process that he wanted to and is trying to undertake. I went to the ordinance committee and spoke at their public forum because I know that this circumvents the planning commission. You still have a chance, as Megan said, to look at this, but it's not a process that you will discuss, and we won't really get the value of all of your collective thoughts about the proposal. And and each one of you represent different perspectives and different parts of the community. And I really value that. So I think that, I am known for really liking process, but I think process leads to, most of the time, better results. And I think when you try to shorten a process, sometimes you end up with an outcome that isn't fully vetted and takes the community by surprise. So I had really hoped that the Planning Commission, I know that you are going to be invited to one of their meetings, but it still doesn't really allow the public as a whole to participate in as many public forums and at as many meetings. Now, for some, you're probably going, woohoo, you hear from the public so much. I know it's very tedious, but I think there's value in it. Sometimes there's those of us that you hear from all the time, but then there are those new people that come in, and I'm not minimizing the fact that those who stay engaged don't have valid input, but there are some individuals who get energized by a topic and give very, very constructive input into a proposal. I'm not going to share with you my position on the proposal. I want to hear the discussion, but I really, really am unhappy with the fact that it's going to be a shorter process and that your involvement will be limited. And I wanted you to know that. And so, yeah, and I guess I just wanted all of you to know, the new members and the continuing members, to know that, your insights and your expertise have real value to the community. So thank you so much. And I will be attending those meetings and listening and trying to understand if his proposal is in the best interest of the community as a whole, or whether we need to gauge this or stage this at a slower pace than Councillor Hanson wants. Anyways, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Megan, do we have any others up?
I don't see any other hands raised or people that contacted me before the meeting. There are a couple of other folks here, but maybe just to listen.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks for those who spoke during our public forum. We'll close that and move on to item 4, which is discussion of enterprise zoning district, the ELM district. Is this yours, David, or?
Yes, that is me, and I'm going to share my screen and I have a few slides for us to walk through, and we'll maybe spend some time talking about some of them in a little bit greater detail. So some time ago, September, I think it was, the commission heard a presentation from John Kahlo and Russ Scully with regard to an interest that they have in rezoning in a portion of the enterprise, rezoning a portion of the enterprise zone, kind of the middle portion around the Innovation Center and Hula, and that they had an expressed interest in that as part of that process of also allowing for some measure of housing. So I think that relates pretty much directly to what you heard Scott Mapes referring to. And we'll touch on that a little bit here in this presentation, but I want to kind of start at the beginning to provide some context around thinking about the enterprise zone, what it is, some of the challenges that we've faced here, and begin to talk about some conceptual ideas for how we might think about that enterprise zone a little bit differently. Excuse me. So many of you will remember the Plan BTV South End Master Plan process that we undertook a few years ago, and ultimately it wasn't actually completed until March of 2019. But that process was really instigated by an understanding that while there's a tremendous amount of success in many parts of the Pine Street corridor, this enterprise zoning district, there are a number of challenges that are presented by the zoning, as well as presented by some of that success, and that we wanted to undertake a planning process to get some public input and consensus around kind of the future of this part of the city. And that plan kind of distilled down to these kind of two guiding yet competing principles about the South End. One is preserving what's unique, kind of the funky eclectic mix of buildings and businesses and energy that there is in the South End that makes it such a cool and fun place to be. As well as a desire to see the South End grow as a center for innovation and business, as it also has been. So figuring out how do we marry these two concepts. And part of that is taking a step back and understanding a little bit better about this enterprise zone itself, what comprises it, and what are the characteristics of it. And the plan really looked at this area in three different areas: the near downtown, the northern part, the arts district, if you will, the central part, which is centered around the Innovation Center, and then the southern end, which is south of Flynn Avenue. And one of the principal recommendations coming out of this planning process was to rethink the zoning in this part of the city to better reflect these characteristics and the various objectives that the city has around how development happens in these places. So in undertaking this work, I've tried to think about this a little more deeply. So understanding we have one enterprise zone, the enterprise light manufacturing zone, runs from the rail yard all the way down to Burton. For the most part, it's all treated the same. However, there are increasingly number of nuances where this particular use can only happen if it's got frontage on Pine Street, or that particular use can only happen, under certain circumstances south of Home Avenue, where we're trying to understand, we're trying to accommodate the fact that there are different characteristics throughout this district. So I've kind of broken this zoning district down into as little as 3 and as many as 6 possible sub-districts. or sub areas for us to kind of think about and talk about in a little bit more detail. So I'm really going to focus on the three big ones. And then, towards the end, we can talk a little bit about, okay, so what happens with this place? This place is a little bit of an anomaly. So we'll get to that towards the end. So the concepts that the plan talks about reflected here are, that the near downtown portion of the enterprise zone being referred to as an arts district or arts hub, as with the innovation district in the middle, that's the bright red portion, and a light manufacturing district, which is the purple in the southern end. And again, I'll talk about these in greater detail as we go through it. We have, as some of you know, but maybe some of the newer commissioners are unfamiliar, we've historically used through our zoning, we've historically used zoning to prevent certain types of high value, high rent return land uses from occurring in this district, specifically housing. This zoning district does not allow for housing anywhere. And that was very intentional in an understanding that housing, given the housing market we have and the demand for housing, the value of properties, the value of spaces will see significant upward pressure. Therefore, those spaces will no longer be affordable to the kind of more traditional commercial, industrial, manufacturing activities that we want and need to have in this part of the city, let alone some of the kind of smaller, funkier arts spaces that are there. But we've seen quite an erosion of that over time. And as the plan well documents, the values of spaces throughout the South End are pretty high. And, in some cases, they compete with commercial values, in other parts of the city and certainly in other parts of the region. So this continues to be a challenge. And as you know, over the past several years, we've seen lots of requests for one-off zoning changes to allow for a grocery store, to allow for a bank, to allow for a bowling alley in different parts of this district, all trying to address what folks see as being a niche opportunity to capture that funky nature of the district, but also with staff struggling to figure out, how do these different one-offs fit together? In one part of the district, this use might be fine, but in another part of the district, it may not be. So we really need to step back and think of this more holistically. So one of the concepts that we introduced in the zoning with one of those proposals was this notion of A and B types of uses, where the A uses are the kinds of land uses we want to see occur in this part of the city. That's really what we want to have happen there, but we recognize that there are other pressures, there are other opportunities. So there's a linkage between, you can have one of these B uses, one of these kind of higher value uses, provided that it's only in a certain space, or only in a certain situation, or it's limited in its size or proportion to an A use. So I just kind of put that out there as a concept to kind of keep in mind as we think about these different sub-districts and how we might treat them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about uses just now, but really thinking about what are these districts and what are their characteristics and what are the kinds of things generally we want to see happen there. The last point I'll make about this is the use of some form of development incentives that would help facilitate other public benefits that we really want to see in this part of the city. Again, whether it's affordable workspaces, or again, as Scott Mapes mentioned, facilitating brownfield remediation. Those are situations where we might think about either incentives around different types of uses that might be permitted, or incentives around, additional building height because a footprint needs to be smaller in order to address a particular site constraint. So I just want to put these ideas out there as we kind of begin to walk through these different areas, which I'll start with what the plan refers to as the Arts Hub. So this is the northern end of the enterprise zone, adjacent to the rail yard, but also wrapping around the barge canal. So the plan really talks about this as a place that would entertain, ground level uses, active ground level uses, 2 to 5 story buildings, active street frontage and facades, really focused on arts and maker businesses and workspaces with limited amount of kind of standalone retail. This is really the what we see in this area right now, and kind of helping it to kind of continue to evolve and thrive as a destination, but also finding ways to retain some of those smaller, more affordable, more funky workspaces. So the area itself, conceptually from the soda plant at the north down to Howard Street, the zoning really to reflect the existing form and scale and pattern of development here. And I wouldn't see the zoning being a significant change of what the underlying zoning here is today, but it would allow for a little bit more flexibility in the types of uses. Typically the kinds of uses that we don't want to see in the southern end of this district, so that we retain larger format industrial spaces. Up here, they would probably be okay. But really accentuating that see it made kind of destination that the art hop is all about. And the art hop really celebrates in this part of the city. So small scale spaces, trying to retain rough and ready spaces that, an artist, a small emerging entrepreneur can use to, undertake dirty and smelly and noisy activities as they grow a business, start a business. That the soda plant in the north and the Unsworth building at the south are really prototypes of the kinds of things that we want to see continue to happen here. If you've ever looked at a floor plan of the soda plant, it's quite an eclectic arrangement of space sizes. Some of them are tiny, some of them are much bigger, but that's really the idea, where you meet the needs of different kinds of businesses in a variety of different ways. So multiple and diverse housing building types reflecting that eclectic character. Buildings that are placed close to the street with parking to the side or to the rear predominantly. Again, a lot of what we see there today. Really a fine grain and pedestrian engaging frontages that really supports pedestrian activity. Once the improvements related to the Southern Connector, the Champlain Parkway, are completed through this part of the city, there'll be a bike path, there'll be improvements to the lighting and the sidewalks. So again, that the infrastructure will be really great to support that kind of activity. And again, around uses, really that, artisan and small scale manufacturing, food and beverage processing, again, typically at smaller scales, shared kitchens and workshops, maker spaces. Those are the kinds of things that we typically would want to see predominantly here. But also understanding that there's, there may be some space for, daycares and preschools, banks, personal services. Again, these are the kinds of businesses that attract higher rents, and can be seen as a threat to the more rough and ready spaces that we want. So we need to be really careful about how we treat those. But again, perhaps there's some linkage between the two as we begin to develop this proposal. So that's the, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, do you want questions now, or do you want to run through all your?
You know, actually, I think it's good, Michael. Let's kind of, I'm kind of done talking about this particular area. So maybe we take questions and have a little bit of a conversation about this Arts Hub notion. So go ahead.
Yeah, my only observation on this is just exploring, I think the small scale use, less than I think it's 5,000 square feet, makes a lot of sense. But if we think to like one of the hottest trends, for better or worse, pre-pandemic, is the sort of I came from Philly, so like Reading Terminal Pier, so a large sort of industrial space that has small kiosk type of vendors inside.
Yep.
That provide what you're talking about, but you don't have segregated spaces within that. And I think these all borrow from some of the examples in Copenhagen in the old port.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great it's a great example where, really small spaces, and I think perhaps as important as that in concept is the flexibility. So you're right, something like the Reading Market, where or some public market, if you will, concept. There are many of them around the country where, it might be Pike Place Market in Seattle is another example, where you've got individual stalls that are leased to a vendor, where they have a secured space to be. They're there on a regular basis. It's kind of an internalizing or bringing the farmers market inside. Certainly that kind of concept ought to work well here as well. So you're right.
And this is actually one of the things that David and I were talking about in preparation for this conversation too, is that we have our local examples of that right now, which is, David already mentioned the soda plant, BCA's studios at 405 Pine. We also have the Hula Project. Those are all much larger footprint buildings that are able to be flexibly subdivided into much smaller spaces. And the size of those spaces can vary over time because of soda plant is a little bit more of a permanent construction in terms of how all those spaces are subdivided. But Hula for sure is much more flexible in terms of how those spaces are divided. So how that kind of prioritization of small space comes out in this ordinance, I think, is something that we need to be really careful about, so we don't preclude opportunities like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't want, give the impression that it has to be like the first generation of live work is like, it's got to be the 400 square feet below the apartment. And in fact, it's much more a communal type of example works a lot better. So that would, just sounds like you're all over that.
We're all over the concept, but the challenge will be how to craft the zoning that allows it to happen very freely and easily, doesn't create a regulatory burden for either the property owner or the city in trying to maintain it, yet kind of preserves that essence rather than somebody coming in and just buying up large spaces. But that's a concept that we definitely want to try to figure out what's the best way to write ordinance language to support it. Any other questions or comments about the Arts Hub before I move on to the next one?
I think the only thing that I want to reiterate from what David said is that when we've talked about approaching the zoning amendment in not just carving off only the innovation district, but looking at the other pieces of it too, I think this piece feels like it's one of the easier pieces to figure out how to just make some minor refinements to where the zoning is today. So I just want to reiterate that point, that this is really not about a lot of sweeping changes to this part of the district.
Right, the underlying zoning here today throughout the ELM is an FAR of 2, 80% lot coverage, 45-foot building height, and basically no front, side, or rear yard setback unless you're adjacent to a residential district. So, in the case here, I wouldn't see much of any of that changing. It's really about tweaking the uses where, we're a little bit more liberal, if you will, in the kind of range of uses that can occur in this part of the district versus some other parts of the district. So I don't see this particularly being hard to do, and from a crafting and ordinance perspective, until we get into trying to fine tune, are there particular tools or mechanisms we use to try to preserve, small or rough and ready space, existing rough and ready spaces, but we may not ultimately end up going there. All right, so I'll move on to the next one, which is the Innovation District. So this is kind of the next area to the south of that, south of the Barge Canal, includes properties south of the Maltex building and down to about Sears Lane. And as you can see in the master plan, there's a lot of orange buildings here that show tremendous opportunity for building new structures on largely vacant spaces. Some of these vacant spaces are, in fact, as Scott Mapes was referring to, are part of the Superfund site and have some real challenges to how they might be redeveloped, the cost of redeveloping them, and what they can be redeveloped for. There are institutional controls in place today that limit the types of uses there. But it's also an area that is going to be bisected to some degree by the Champlain Parkway as it comes in from the south. So that too kind of creates an opportunity in how we think about this area. So as I've drawn this is really Howard Street south down to Sears Lane, but not including the properties that front on Pine Street south of Lakeside Avenue. They're a little bit different, and we'll maybe talk about those a little bit later. But some large surface parking lots that are prime opportunities for redevelopment of one form or another. The Superfund sites at the northern end of that. I've also included dealer.com. And I've included Jackson Terrace here, particularly if the conversation, and I stress the if because we want to put it out there and have a conversation about housing, but I recognize as well as anyone that can be a very challenging conversation. But I think there's an opportunity here. Jackson Terrace is an anomaly within the enterprise zone, within the surrounding low density residential district. And, we ought to, particularly if there's a thought of including housing in this area, it ought to be captured so that it can become a conforming use.
Can you point out where Jackson Terrace is?
Oh, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
It's right here, north of Callahan Park. So dealer.com here, and Jackson Terrace is just south of that. So this district is where I think the most opportunity for doing things differently and more creatively reside. It's really, there are a lot of brownfield sites that need to be redeveloped. There's a lot of surface parking lots that need to be redeveloped. All of that work, the redevelopment of both of those types of properties, will have significant benefits when it comes to stormwater runoff and other kind of environmental benefits. So it's a really good thing to see these sites redeveloped to more modern standards. But really seeing this as a new mixed-use employment center that really incubates growing and emerging technologies, R&D, manufacturing and innovation, really embracing the kinds of things that we see going on within the Innovation Center itself, Within Hula in particular today, the generator, dealer.com, a lot of those kinds of businesses, those kinds of workspace and workspace relationships, there's a real opportunity to build upon that in a pretty big way, but just because there's so much opportunity here. It's also centered around a multimodal transit node. Down here at the end of Sears Lane is a parcel that the city originally acquired. Some of you will remember the idea of a South End Transit Center. That, again, could serve a similar function going on in the future, as it's flanked by the Champlain Parkway to the east and a rail line to the west. So again, that's something else to kind of think about how this area might evolve in the future. Not just as a multimodal or intermodal transportation hub, but also a place where parking can be provided as a resource to multiple properties. One thing that's pretty characteristic throughout the South End is a dearth of kind of publicly available parking. There's very little on-street parking. There's no public parking lots. All of the parking in this part of the city is provided on a lot by lot or business by business basis, which, you know, as you can appreciate, can be really challenging, particularly for smaller sites. If there were an opportunity to create some sort of a transportation center here that provided a supply of publicly available parking, that could then free up more space on some of these sites to do things that are more productive and more interesting. There's some very large blocks here that would probably benefit by being broken up through some sort of internal circulation networks. And certainly the Champlain Parkway will do some of that. But again, given the size of the parking lot here by the Innovation Center and the parking lot down here, there's going to have to be some other form of internal circulation to move vehicles and move people to and through these spaces. So there's an opportunity to create some smaller blocks within that, and then depending on how they're developed, activating those thoroughfares with kind of street level active uses in a more fine-grained way. And again, you know, in all of these places, we would want to see some collection of small spaces, just because small spaces are just by their nature more affordable. Even if the rents are at full market rent, a smaller space is simply going to be a lot cheaper for somebody to get into, for that small business that they don't need 10,000 square feet, they only need 2. And if they can find a 2,000 square foot space to get into, then they're going to really be able to launch themselves rather than, you know, not. Primary uses here are those, you know, R&D, labs, technical offices, you know, some degree of manufacturing at different scales, as well as prototyping, studio spaces, again, shared kitchens, maker spaces, you know, generator is in this area. You know, perhaps there's more opportunity to do more of those shared kind of spaces here. Maybe less of an interest, less of a need to segregate the B types of uses, because if we're really trying to create a more of a activity node here, we would want those, you know, retail and service and cafes and restaurants and things in this area on their own. Structured parking, as I mentioned before. And then this is really the place where I think, if we're going to have a conversation about housing in any part of the enterprise zone, this would be the place to have that conversation. But typically that housing would occur on upper stories, And perhaps it needs to be tied to the remediation of brownfield sites or, some other mechanism to support the employment center. But that becomes an open question for all of us to talk about in a little bit more detail. So that's the enterprise innovation district concept. Happy to take any questions that folks might have or comments people might have for now.
Any questions for David on this?
Yeah, David, I always envisioned, a long time ago lived in Boulder, and when the fast track system came to Boulder, if it is even there yet, they had this transit village that was heavy on the TDM, and I always have thought that this is very reminiscent of that. So as far as an analog, it might be helpful. At this point, it's fully developed.
Yeah, I think I'm familiar with that area if I'm thinking of the same place. And there's a lot of transit opportunity here, as well as just the idea of kind of creating this center of activity around, whether it's tech transfer from the university, from Champlain College. Of course, Champlain College already has a facility here doing some of that stuff. How do we move some of those innovative ideas and technologies out of the academic world into the market and help them to grow? When you when you think about hula as a concept, and I'm going to keep referring to it because I think as a concept, it's a really interesting thing where, these are small, fast-growing businesses that are occupying space in hula, but they won't be there for very long. They actually have fairly short leases, and they're going to have to move. So the question is, where are they going to move to? We want to create spaces that, those businesses can grow out of hula and then into something else in order to kind of keep them in Burlington and keep that vibrancy here, that employment base. But again, back to the housing argument, that's one of the impediments to a lot of these kinds of businesses being attracted to Burlington, being able to grow in Burlington, is the cost and availability of housing. So that becomes a really important concept here. And again, to your point, Michael, there's a transportation component to that as well, that folks want to live close to where they work. They want to be able to ride their bikes. They want to be able to take transit. And this is a real opportunity to do something really interesting in this part of the city.
David, I have a question.
Yes.
Just wondering, there's probably a good reason for this, but wondering why the commercial strip on Pine Street, just to the east of the lower section, why that isn't shaded in red? I mean, is that because it's already commercial?
It becomes a bit of a different place in that the areas that are shaded in red are either already a fairly large footprint building that's doing some of this tech kind of work, or it's just a big surface parking lot. So there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity to do something different. Once you get out on Pine Street itself, there's now a pattern of development there that's already in place. There are different collection of businesses there. Yes, there's some, food and beverage businesses there, but there's also, historically, but continues to be some kind of auto-oriented service repair kinds of businesses. And in order to try to retain those spaces as they are, protect them for what they are, it might be the kind of place where you wouldn't want to introduce housing in the conversation. I know that some of those property owners would not want us to be talking about housing, just from the South End master plan conversation.
Makes sense.
But, it's an open question, and, because I don't have an answer for you, Alex, as to, well, where does that fit then? Because I'm not quite sure yet.
I mean, I guess the answer to my own question is sort of like that those are commercial spaces that they're not going anywhere. The zoning for them should not change.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, but Alex, I think it's interesting because that's also your connectivity. I mean, otherwise you kind of have to sneak around the corner to get to these new uses. And if the opportunity presents it, it'd be great to, have better connectivity to Pine. So it's a little more porous. I don't know. It's kind of interesting that I see where David's coming from, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question too, because one of the other, I guess, identities of the South End that the plan talks about is the idea of kind of a little center of activity and making the area around the Champlain School more of a walkable place and having more activity that people might kind of stop into. And we know that, of course, Pine Street is anchored at Flynn Avenue with the new mixed-use development that Redstone developed. So it's definitely also one of those kinds of questions that Dave and I have kind of been going back and forth, like how far north does that sort of concept extend along the Pine Street corridor, or should it extend along the Pine Street corridor?
Right, because that intersection that Megan's referring to is a neighborhood activity center. So it does allow for housing, it does allow for mixed use. So it too is different than the things that are around it, which kind of leaves this section of Pine Street as a little bit of an orphan, and depending on how you think of it. But from that connectivity perspective, ultimately the Champlain Parkway is this kind of bright red line running through this map. So, that's where the bulk of the traffic coming in and likely out of this part of the city will be, with then, intersections at Sears Lane, Flynn, Home Avenue, and the like. So,
Yeah. David,
yes.
on that part of Pine Street, and that area in the enterprise zone, how easy will it be to cross the Champlain Parkway?
It won't be, other than at the intersections, it won't be.
So it's really going to divide. It really has
Yeah.
divide the zone in half.
It is going to divide this area significantly because it's a limited access highway that has very little kind of, it doesn't relate, it doesn't kind of recognize, face, embrace the private property and how the private property might develop alongside of it very well. It's just a roadway with a bike lane.
Well,
So-
right, and it's a roadway that I believe will be at 25 miles per hour. So I just want to be careful about saying it's a limited access highway, because I know that a lot has gone into the, sorry, the screen is about to shut down. Keep it on. Okay, there we go. A lot has gone into the refinement of that segment of the Champlain Parkway design, so that it actually has a full kind of separate mixed use pathway and is a 25 mile per hour designed street in this area. But I think the challenge and where it is still limited access is that it has the fencing on both sides of the street. And I know that we talked about this a lot in the group, Emily may remember this, in the group that was working on revisions to the South End plan, that that is the likely reality of the Champlain Parkway when it is first implemented, but the long-term potential for us to remediate some of that and make it a little bit more permeable and have better connections to the development along it is a long-term opportunity. So while I think it will divide that portion of the district in the short term, it's still appropriate for us to think about how development on both sides of that street relate to the street in this zoning conversation.
Right, it's just not going to be like Main Street, and they're not going to be, when we say limited access, it's, they're not going to be any curb cuts between the intersections or any new intersections that are introduced. It is what it is, and development, at least in the short term, will have to find a way to embrace it. And then, as Megan points out, over the long term, there could be much greater integration in the design.
I have a question regarding height limits.
Uh-huh.
You meant, I heard one thing I took away was 45 feet. I wondered if you had, what the thought was around heights, because this seems to me like a bit of a blank canvas. And there are the existing buildings, for the most part, are 1-2 stories. And it's not like there's views behind a lot of these buildings of the lake that need to be preserved. So I guess I was surprised to hear those lower numbers. So I'm wondering what the thought is around heights, because it seems to me like an opportunity to have density. And then as a follow-up question, I know in parts of the of the downtown, like there's square footage requirements, like 50% of the building square footage has to be office space or commercial. Are there thoughts for some sort of zoning like that?
Well, let me answer that part first. We actually eliminated that requirement
Yeah.
of ratio of residential to non-residential uses in the downtown. But as with regard to height, I like the way you're thinking, because those are all, I think, arguments for thinking about why couldn't you go higher than 45 feet here? The Innovation Center is taller than 45 feet. And that sets kind of a standard of an opportunity to think of taller buildings. And as you point out, Emily, you're not blocking somebody else's view. It's pretty flat. And I think you could go up to 5 stories. Could you go to 6? Perhaps, and do something a little bit more intense, something more urban here than you would in any other part of this part of the city. Any other thoughts or questions about this one?
Yeah, I think we talked about this the first time this came up, but it seems like another good opportunity for form-based code, particularly in this segment, because like those tech firms just want to be flexible and figure out what's best for them, so long as they know the sort of envelope they need to fit in. And I think that could be really successful here, kind of getting out of the way a little bit.
Yeah, and particularly because you are creating something from whole cloth, so you kind of need to define what's the character that you're trying to create here. And there's some large expanses you want to be sure that you break up into smaller elements. So I think if it's not a form-based code itself, there are a lot of form-based elements that would go into the zoning in this part of this district.
Right, I guess I just want to ask a clarifying question, Michael, because I think what I heard you say at the very end was to just kind of get out of the way. And so I think you were thinking, it sounds like maybe what you're suggesting is embracing more of a form code in the sense that we take a really light touch to caring about the uses. Is that what you were meaning by that?
I do. I mean, I know like some of these uses what you want to see, but I think that's sort of, there's probably like the macro, there's a macro use that's already occurring that is sort of jobs, right? And highly skilled workers. And I think that is likely to continue, particularly if they can grow and provide housing that's nearby. I think the other things, there's probably a natural market for those, probably in particular the B uses, which, living nearby look pretty attractive to me. But I guess I'm in this particular area, again, I wasn't, obviously I wasn't here for the South End plan, but that almost seems a little less important, but it might happen naturally if you set the form such that there are spaces to accommodate that. But I do think there's an element of letting tech sort of figure out what best works that would be consistent with what's already gone on here. I mean, you look at Dealer and Hula, and they're just big empty spaces right? That they sort of figured out how to, it wasn't very prescriptive on the way that that kind of came together. They just had a big box to work with. And so I think similarly, that could be interesting here.
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Megan.
I was just gonna say, this is also one of these questions. You guys are hitting on all the questions that David and I have been debating. Is, to what extent would we try to regulate form here? And I know if Emily's still here, she'll remember that when we were talking about this part of the district in the South End planning process, we said, this is an area of the city where we really have an opportunity to be as creative as possible with the architecture, the use of materials, that it is really a blank canvas, and that can be an opportunity to just further contribute to the identity of the South End as sort of funky and organic. So thinking about form elements, which maybe are more about massing and the relationship of the building's entrances to the streets, and maybe not as highly regulated a form district as we have downtown, is sort of a question that we've been kicking around about this.
I would certainly agree with that. I think that if the form is too prescriptive, you risk having like a ye olde town center look here, where you're trying to mimic something that doesn't exist and an older style that isn't on the ground. Like, there are not, brownstone type houses in this area. So asking new buildings to look like something fake that doesn't exist there, that never exists there, I think creates a inauthenticity of the area, right? Like, oh, let's make this into a Western town. I think it's a blank slate. It's an industrial. There's an industrial form that I think is the character of this area, and that it can be a lot more modern and non-prescriptive would be my thought.
I think you would do, yeah. I do think you want to pick your civic areas, which, there's already been some work on there, and be prescriptive about those, but.
Right, it's really about the relationship of the building to the street, because, again, Hula and Dealer, the Innovation Center too, to some extent, they're big boxes that, everything happens inside. They really don't face outward and embrace outward kind of what's around them. So you're going to want new buildings that are put in here around any sort of circulation system, whether it's pedestrian or vehicular. You're going to want them to have some relationship to the outside world that draws people kind of to and through them. So I think
but they do make use of amenity, I guess I would say, right? So like Hula has the lake, and so if you've got a civic space that's amenity, that's some sort of
has the bike
interesting
path.
amenity, they'll jump all over it. Sorry, Alex.
Yeah.
Oh, I interrupted you. Hula has the bike path, which was recently improved, which benefits Hula.
Yeah, and it actually does kind of face, embraces the bike path with kind of the openings in the entrance that they've placed there. But, when you look at that large surface parking lot and kind of how people are going to move through that, it creates a space for, probably not as prescriptive a shop frontage type requirement we have in the downtown, but at least some of those basic elements, so that you're kind of creating that realm. All right, any other thoughts or comments on this part before I move on?
I think one question that I would be interested in hearing the commission's thoughts on is, David put, this question here about multifamily upper story housing, and curious how folks are feeling about housing as a standalone use versus housing that is in support of other, I think Michael said, the predominant land use that is jobs.
For me, whether or not housing gets incorporated into this, we've been trying so carefully to make sure that the enterprise area is really focused on innovation, on the small businesses, on the arts, on all these different things. And just the concern that we've had before and that I continue to have is if you allow housing to take too predominant of a role, there is a great need for it. And it could start to squeeze out and become the primary use there. So I still want to be careful of that, that we don't lose what, we've worked so hard to help create there over the years. And, just mindful of the fact that all around this, this is like the donut hole of housing that's all around. So, it's not like there isn't any housing there. You mentioned the development at Flynn and Pine, the mixed use development there. And all down the rest of Pine Street, it's all housing, all on the side roads are housing, all around it. So there may be some opportunities in here for limited housing, but I think we'd have to be really, really careful not to let that take over, in my mind, take over the district and have it become predominantly housing area over time.
I'm in full agreement with Andy.
I see the housing as being in support of the industry and commercial spaces, thinking about smaller units for, 1 bedroom. This area is surrounded by housing, but if you look at the kind of housing that's around this area, it's like kind of vestiges of suburban design with, multiple, like 4-bedroom houses with lawns, if you look just a little bit away. So I personally think that small units for workforce housing in support of some of like Hula and dealer.com. I mean, it just kills me that dealer.com's parking lot is full and they have overflow parking, and our biggest carbon impact is people driving into these places to work and then driving home. And if we had a real density of small unit housing, I think you would see a lot of people living right there. And that really is the legacy of this area. Because if you look, I used to do the tours for Preservation Burlington on Pine Street. When we give the tours of Pine Street, a lot of those smaller streets like Marble Ave and things like that had really, really small houses. And those small houses housed the people who worked in the Maltex building and worked in all of these industrial spaces that are downtown. So I think there's a legacy of that, and we can continue that to have a density of small workforce housing that supports this. Like look at Conger Ave. There are some leftover large apartment buildings there that that used to just house people who worked at GE, worked at the places down in this part of town.
I guess I'd advocate for more housing. I think it will be complementary. I think if you say, okay, housing secondary, what do you get? I mean, you're not going to get a new office building anytime soon, decades, given where we are with the post-COVID economy and already the amount of office vacancy. So I think if you say it's not going to be housing centric and you're not going to use housing to sort of pull out some of these other uses, you're looking at continued use of surface parking and continued stormwater runoff issues and the like. So I guess I just interject that thought because I don't see anyone doing new build on office or makerspace, unfortunately.
Just because the market's not really there to support that cost.
But where will the market be in 3 or 5 years? I mean,
we just have a lot of existing space to accommodate those needs for some amount of time. I don't know what the absorption is, but the Maltex building, for example, has space available. I don't know how fully leased the Innovation Center is. So
can I say jump in for a second? Yeah. So the Maltex building is full. Kilburn and Gates is full. The Innovation Center is 95% full. So there's not great swaths of open office space that no one's renting. It's full. People want to be in the South End. They want to locate their businesses in the South End. You know, the fact that Dealer and Marvell have not really fully reoccupied is because they occupy so much square footage that on a corporate level, they've just decided to have people working from home because they want to keep them safe. But they're paying rent on a daily basis. So, you know, it's not like there's giant swaths of office space. If anything, realistically, where there's going to be empty office space is in the downtown core, because people are not happy with being there in their offices anymore. They don't like working downtown. They don't like walking in their cars at night. In the downtown, we're going to see office spaces go empty. But in the South End, the demand is extraordinarily strong and remains and has been. And I don't see that. You know, it's not like people are not going to want office space, you know, for the next 10 years. That may be occurring in other parts of the country, but it's not occurring here.
Do you think there would be an appetite for new construction, you know, office or something office light, you know, whatever you want to call the modern innovation of office in this area?
Well, I look at like what James Unsworth did with the vaults. So the vaults is a really good project because it's on the periphery of the commercial stuff that he's already got. It's new build. You know, he took down some pretty junky stuff to put it up, and it's commercial on the ground floor with some residential component and some office component. You know, it's a very interesting question because, you know, I'm listening to you all talk about it, and, you know, here's the reality. I think you're all right with what you're saying. I think that, you know, properly done, housing that supported the people who want to work in the South End would do pretty well. I personally probably would not be a fan of converting existing office spaces back to residential because I think that we would lose something, but I could see new build being constructed in the South End with the idea being that it's exactly that. It's meant to complement the existing industries that are there, and where you can indeed program in, you know, smaller units. Because the reality is that micro units, you know, 500, 600 square feet are really where the strength of the market's at. And the reality is that the cost of construction, particularly in Burlington, is so high that to make the numbers work on anything larger than a small unit, because, you know, if you have, call it 100,000 square feet and you're doing 500 square foot units, you know, you can probably get 40, you know, or whatever, for whatever the math is, 40 units as opposed to 1,000 square foot units where you could only get, you know, 20. And so the smaller units on a per square foot basis rent for a much higher amount than the larger units. So Emily's correct, you know, small units that would allow people to live there and you know, eventually grow into something larger would be a very good idea. It would probably help to incentivize businesses to continue to locate in the South End. But it's a very careful balance, because what you don't want to do is create a wholesale frenzy where all of a sudden people who have office buildings look at the numbers and say, well, I can realize more on a per square foot basis by converting to residential, so I'm going to convert to residential. And all of a sudden, all that energy, all that, you know, tech energy and all the, you know, miraculous sort of changeovers that we've seen on all these old industrial properties disappears because there's no jobs to support the people who want to be there. So it's a fragile ecosystem, you know, and I guess, you know, this all started, I think, with both Russ and Hula looking to see if there was a possibility of incorporating some housing that might support Hula, which seems like a neat idea. And Rick Davis really does have a time-sensitive issue in that his lot, the 8 acres that he owns, that's in between the Maltex building and Burlington Electric, on those 8 acres, you could really only build about 100,000 square feet, maybe more if the height were above 5 stories. But the costs associated with developing that site are so staggering, because literally the easy way to think about it is there's a giant bubble of nasty coal tar that's trapped beneath the surface of what was a bunch of sawdust that filled the lake. And it's there as a residue from the coal tar gasification plant that used to exist on that site. And it's on the edge of the lake. And if you put too much pressure on it, kind of like a bubble, when you blow a bubble with bubble gum, it can pop, or even worse, it can release into the lake. So in order to develop that site, what you need to do is remove the equivalent amount of soil weight to what it is you're going to put on it to allow for parking and cars and people. And you've got to go down about 275 feet with steel pilings to put a building on a floating slab. But it's developable, and the brownfields grants that the state has gotten has allocated about $6 million to offset the additional costs of developing that site. But they can't hold the money forever. And that's why he had Scott read the letter and sort of state his position. So he's got an opportunity that's very time sensitive, but that's about the only one that's time sensitive in that same manner down in the south end.
So I guess as a follow-up question, I heard you on the fear of conversion, but in terms of, I think the building you're describing has a small, that's right up from dealer there. Is that the one you were describing that has the small work component in the bottom?
Yeah, it's work in the bottom and sort of on the north side of the building.
Across the street from dealer.
The
Across
vault is at 28 Howard Street.
So
Correct.
it's still primarily residential though, no?
No, it's primarily commercial with residential added. So the Howard Street facing side is residential. And then the west facing side that faces the alleyway that sort of puts you back into that whole complex back there is commercial, and up above it is commercial as well.
Okay, got it.
So it's got sort of two facings, a commercial side facing what is really sort of the commercial side, and a residential side facing the neighborhood that it's part of.
Huh.
It's well done.
Yves, I heard you make an important distinction in your comments about, housing perhaps is an okay thing if it's new construction rather than in an existing building.
Well, the reason I say that, David, is because I think that a lot of the buildings. So two things. If you look at what's been happening in the South End, the first thing that happened was in the 1980s, the mills started shifting over, and really the first one who really was a sort of a leader, I guess, in the game, it was Rick Davis, who in the 1980s, he started down on Battery Street. He did, the Ice House, and he did a couple other buildings down there. And then he bought the Maltex, which was just, it was a hulk. And he redid it into purposefully incubator-sized spaces. So every space, there's a center core that has the elevator and the restrooms, and then all around the perimeter of the building, so they all have nice views and good windows. There are small office suites, each one with its own HVAC unit. And it was a really good sort of incubator. And I think that preserving those old buildings in their existing uses, which has been sort of a conversion, I'm sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. And then the follow-up conversions have been the steel buildings. So the dealer.com building and the old plumbing supply place, which is now Zero Gravity, and Lake Champlain Chocolate. So all these buildings that have had long time industrial uses have been slowly but surely being converted into these funky kind of cool office type spaces. But they don't necessarily lend themselves well to small size conversions for the very reason that their ceilings are so high. So if you think about a 500 square foot apartment that has a 17-foot ceiling, it's going to feel pretty strange because it's going to be taller than it is wide. And that's an odd feeling in anything. Whereas if you were to build new builds in that area, you could really program spaces such that they feel right, and so that you're taking advantage of the density and the height to get more units. And I don't think you're able to do that in any of these old industrial buildings. It's much, much harder and much, much more complicated. And from an engineering perspective, it's much harder as well.
Well, and those existing buildings are where the potential for more affordable spaces really lies. If you're going to do new construction, it's going to be a lot more expensive. So therefore, you're not going to build rough and ready space for, AO glass to move into, or for some, small entrepreneur. So
I'm sorry to interrupt, Dave. That's a perfect analogy, because right now we're reaching the point commercially in our market where the cost of construction is so high on a per square foot basis that the rents that you need to charge are not sustainable in our market. So, in other words, right now the South End is renting for roughly $16, maybe $16.50 a square foot on a triple net basis. And what that means is, you can afford up to about $200 a foot to build, all in, including the land costs, the soft costs, et cetera. It's going to cost you an awful lot more than that to build residential. So you can justify building new residential, but you can no longer justify building new office, new retail, and even with the land cost in Burlington, new manufacturing, you can't justify that either.
Yeah,
I guess that was kind of the premise of the original question, hearing, and we pointed to the example on Howard, I guess, but that was sort of my intuition. And do you see that dynamic really changing? Because I just think about, in terms of putting together the zoning, last thing I think you want to do is, I just don't think these surface parking lots do us much good when we have what is a recognized public need of housing. And certainly we don't want the conversions, but if it's true that there might be a lot of office construction or something that looks like office, then, I might have a different opinion. But I guess what I'm hearing from you now is that that's really going to be difficult for some time.
Yeah, building new, that's unfortunately one of the reasons why City Place is having such a hard time, because it's if it's retail, you can only do so much on a per square foot basis in retail sales, and your rent has to be a percentage of that. And if your rent is much higher as a percentage, you're not profitable. And that's the point we've reached in the market, is where we're simply not able to justify, unless it's on a really, really large scale, the cost, unless it's housing. So you're right. My worry would be, again, I'm great with incentivizing new construction as housing, which I think would benefit the South End. But how do you separate incentivizing new construction to provide housing that's going to support the jobs, while at the same time saying to the people who have existing buildings, well, we'd really prefer you not convert to housing, because then we're going to lose the office space and the manufacturing space and the R&D space that makes the South End exactly what it is, which is this sort of tech corridor where all the real commercial activity for the last 10 years and probably the foreseeable future is going to take place in Burlington.
right.
So, yeah, and I think part of that too is just like keeping a pretty tight district where housing is allowed. I also I know, Bryn, you came off mute a while ago. Did you want to weigh in here?
A little while ago, I was just thinking about how beneficial a larger multifamily housing unit with smaller units would be, cutting back on driving and the need for parking, and then also thinking about housing moving into the future and being more green. We need buildings that are larger, housing more people, and are more efficient. And so I just thought that was a really great thing, and to keep that as part of this area, I think would be really important.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Agreed.
I think the one other thing that I would just add here is that some of the planning commissioners will remember that we also talked about the housing equivalent of hula a few years ago. This question came up about kind of like a co-housing, but in a multifamily context. And I do think that this will be part of our deliberations for this zoning amendment going forward too. John and Russ have expressed an interest in revisiting that concept and seeing if there's an opportunity to think in a very flexible way about types of housing that could be allowed in this part of the district.
Megan, that's an interesting concept. I actually think something like that, we talked about that on North Ave, on the new development there. That's where it came up. But I think that would actually fit really well in the enterprise zone, something like that. Because it has that same kind of almost feel of what's being created there to begin with.
Keep in mind, one thing when we talk about this. So I live across from Cambrian Rise. And so Cambrian Rise is primarily 1-bedrooms and studios, which works really well for a single person or a couple. But as soon as they begin to have children, if they decide to, and most seem to, then it no longer works. It's too small. There's no yard. People don't really want it, which is why we're seeing really, sort of a renaissance of not only the old North End, but now the new North End, which is where sort of the millennials who, always, oh, we're never going to settle down. We're going to keep a job for 2 years and move across the country and have another one. Well, they've reached that age where they've sort of decided, well, that kind of sucks. We don't like living in a suitcase and we're ready to settle down. So understand that when you say multifamily, that is not efficient. Like you're not going to get family housing right now unless it's subsidized, because it's simply not economical to build and the demand is not there. It just isn't. The people are not looking to live in apartments if they have a couple kids. You can speak with any of the housing developers and they'll kind of tell you the same thing. So,
yeah,
are they feeders? Like Emily, you brought up something really important, which is, if you look at the Innovation Center, so a couple things. The Innovation Center started off as a 3-story building. It was built in 1890. And they added a 4th story to that building in 1920 while it was the Queen City Cotton Company, and it was still in full operation. They did that. And that whole neighborhood, that whole Lakeside Avenue neighborhood was built by the Queen City Cotton Company to house their employees. The whole neighborhood. It used to be all by itself out there by the mill. It had a little hospital, it had a little retail store, a general store, you name it, it had it.
Company town.
It's exactly what it was, Alex. It's fascinating, the history. So.
Right.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Sorry, David, we keep talking at the exact same time and I have a feeling we're gonna say similar things, but I do think that the reality of where the location that we're talking about is multi-unit development, and what the scale of that looks like, whether it's, small apartments or if there's some other kind of mix of attached dwellings, like, maybe some limited townhouses or some other kind of, the point being, maybe I should have used the term multi-unit development rather than multifamily. That's the term that we're trying to get better about using. But I think that's the reality of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. I should have used the word multi-unit, not family, but understanding that folks will live in these units for a certain period of time. Then, if they're looking to have a family and to have a house with a yard, yes, then they're going to move into the surrounding neighborhoods. But those small units then also become a place for the folks that have raised their families in those neighborhoods to then age in place, stay in the neighborhood, stay close to their friends, perhaps their family, but no longer have a yard and all of the stuff that goes along with, a traditional suburban lifestyle. So I think there's purpose in those kinds of units over time as well.
Right. Kind of like we've talked about the lifespan of an ADU's utility.
Right.
Okay, sorry. I thought I was asking a pretty straightforward question, but this has actually been a really helpful discussion. I've taken a lot of notes about your perspectives on the question of housing. But I am also paying attention to the time, Andy, for in case you're wanting us to move us along. And I think there were a few more questions that David just wanted to address.
Yeah, I'm going to move on unless there's something burning here. When like we said with the Arts Hub area, zoning changes in that area is not a big lift. It's not a big change from what's there. It's really focused more on uses. Same can be said for the southernmost end of this, the R&D and industry area, kind of certainly south of Sears Lane, but more like south of Flynn Avenue. And there are some parcels here where it kind of begin to question, where do they fit? You know, the oil tanks here on Flynn Avenue is zoned residential today. It used to be zoned enterprise. It got zoned residential with the notion that we don't want it to always be oil tanks. What would we want it to be in the future? I think that still remains an open question, but largely the area south of Flynn Avenue. And this is really a place where the enterprise zone, as we have always intended it to be, really focused on light manufacturing, providing, you know, larger footprint, more at scale manufacturing and production in larger businesses within this part of the city. So pretty similar to the kind of zoning that has always been there. And probably a stricter focus on those manufacturing type of uses, and less so on the non-manufacturing uses. That, you know, this is a place where, you know, we would be much stricter about standalone office, standalone retail. Really, those things really need to be much more accessory in nature. Thoughts about this one?
I agree. I think it's really important to keep this kind of thing there where it is. Right? I have a friend who's a carpenter who has a shop that he rents in Burlington, and he really was looking for some shop space, maybe down off of Home Avenue. He and his wife decided to sell their house and move, and it's kind of I'm heartbroken because, you know, they have a young child. It's the kind of person I would think would stay in Burlington. He's already been in Burlington for 20 years. You know, that the idea that you need to preserve space for small businesses, small companies, people, I've talked about this before, people who want to make a little noise in the course of their business and not upset the neighbors.
Yep, and that's really the kind of, you know, the kind of business I might see is, you know, fits in the art hub. Again, if you can find space, but, you know, they're smaller spaces, they're, you know, one or two carpenters that work in there making furniture, or, you know, doing, you know, finish work, or just a shop that they use to kind of store equipment and materials that they take back and forth to a job site. You know, this is a little bit more at scale. This part of the city I would see as being a little bit more larger scale, more mechanized, you know, again, the kind of businesses that are there, you know, making can openers and making cookie dough. You know, I wish Burton were making a lot more snowboards here, but that's more the idea for this part of the district. So if there are no particular thoughts or comments about this, I'll just highlight then there are these other places that we're not quite sure what to do with. The rail yard itself, you know, is this something that stands alone? You know, it's a unique kind of function and activity. And it's likely, it has the potential to evolve over time in this function of activity, but, you know, is it a standalone sub area restricted and focused to rail operations and intermodal transfer as it is today, or is it just part of the ELM? We just basically don't change the zoning here at all.
I think in this area, because we really haven't done anything, all it really is right now is the rail yards. If it is going to evolve into something else, I think this is one that we could really be creative on and not have it be bounded by, you know, the pre-existing things that are there, that you know, how it's evolved over time, because it really hasn't. If you know, if it's going to change from a rail yard, there's wholesale changes that would happen. So again, I think we could be creative on helping it evolve and not be limited by any preconceived notions of what it could be, or what's around it.
I think that ultimately becomes a question is, would we want to see it change from being a rail yard? Is this an important function that we have in the city that we want to be sure that we're able to protect and maintain? Or do we want to see it change, as maybe I hear you suggest?
Actually, that's something I think we might need to be educated on. What its usage is as a rail yard, the importance of it. And I think that's evolved over time, but right now I don't really have a sense of how active it is, how active it should be, what it could be, as a rail yard. I know rail yards typically have been, historically have been really important because they do form a hub of activity, but I just don't have a good sense of what this is contributing right now to our community.
Well, I do think that one future opportunity for the rail yard is the return of Amtrak and the storage of the trains overnight. And I don't know if you all know, but they have been doing test runs of Amtrak in Burlington again. So I do think that there is some future use of this as a rail yard to support that.
Well, Amtrak, I think I think the Amtrak train coming here again is hugely important, so.
And the rail function itself is very important and quite vibrant. There is the repair facility here with the roundhouse. There's also a lot of intermodal transfer of materials that happens on the other side of the yard, whether that's salt and earth products, rock, sand, and the like that is offloaded and moves into trucks on the other side, as well as fuel oils. It's pretty active site that way. Assembly of trains. So, the conversation around the rail yard in terms of them kind of thinking about their future is more, it's quite viable here, but there are also other sites that they've looked at in other parts of the region and beyond where they might even be able to expand. So
again, I think it might be helpful, David and Megan, if at some point we got, perhaps a more in-depth report or explanation of what's going on there. And it may be that the best use of it is the rail yard and how we could help improve that or expand it. But I think it'd be really helpful for us as a commission to really understand better what it's being used for now and what some of its potentials might be.
Okay.
Before really being able to say what it's, whether it should be just enterprise zone or something else. I think we need to have a better understanding of what it is.
Okay. Let me move through these other sites just again to at least introduce them to you. We talked about this a little bit before. This is the Pine Street corridor itself, south of Lakeside, between Lakeside and the old Champlain School. Lots of kind of vehicular service. There's now a couple of breweries here and some food service and some retail that happens in these spaces. Again, this is not a place that likely, I'm guessing, we would want to encourage housing, and particularly based on that last conversation and thinking about not wanting to see these sites convert to housing if they were even able to, but want to kind of retain them as they are because they're the essence of that kind of smaller, more rough and ready kinds of spaces. But again, does it stand alone? Does it fit with something else? Directly to the south of this here is the Champlain School, and then we're into a neighborhood activity center that surrounds the intersection of Pine and Flynn. So I'll move on to the next one because we've kind of talked about that a little bit already. So Flynn Avenue. So this area here, and here's the intersection of Pine and Flynn. Again, this is the neighborhood activity center, allows for mixed use, particularly multi-unit residential uses. So, you know, here is City Market, and then what is now an ongoing collection of small and larger businesses, breweries, design shops and the like that are occupying these spaces. Again, probably not a place we would want to encourage housing, but really want to kind of enable the kinds of activities that are happening there today. Question being some of the more customer facing businesses that we're starting to see. You know, I'm excited to see that Burlington Beer Company is finally in Burlington. That's a great thing. But they have a pretty big footprint of, you know, non-brewing and warehousing activities there in that space. It's really cool. I can't wait to go visit it. But again, is that the, you know, are those the kinds of things we really want to encourage in this part of the city or not? It's kind of an open question. So that it's really was those three sites that are still kind of outliers for me in terms of how they get treated. So unless there are kind of comments and questions about these, we can kind of wrap this up and we'll continue to work on it.
So David, where does this go from here now?
So I think kind of based on the conversations that we've had tonight, kind of going back and continuing to think this through, try to provide some more refinements. And ultimately, I think the next steps are going to be going and meeting with folks in the South End, the, you know, SEBA and businesses and NPAs and the like, and beginning to have more of a conversation with the folks in the neighborhood about some of these ideas.
So just one suggestion as you do all of that is, I'm not sure yet, you know, how much this dovetails with the South End plan and how much it may diverge from it. But as much as you could tie it in to the South End plan, probably the better, you know, and you know, the more that could be used as the guidance for this. And if there are places where it diverges, you know, that could be fine, but just, you know, let people know where it diverges and why.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. That's definitely part of the thinking here is how do we, you know, try to stay as true as we try to stay true to the South End plan and what recommendations it was offering.
Yeah, and again, as I said, you know, as we've been, you know, as we use it, as we learn from experience with it, there may be places it does need to diverge, or it might be wise for it to diverge, and that could be okay. You know, we don't need to always be stuck to a plan if there's, you know, better thinking that might be out there, but just, you know, explain why is really what it would be.
It may be that also the community is more receptive and
Right.
things have changed about, you know, how people feel about housing in the South End. And I think having Hula, you know, be the driver of something, and, you know, they've done such a beautiful job with their space now. I think you're going to see a lot more buy-in with people in the South End than you did when we were talking about it in the theoretical way.
I hope so.
I like the 3 zones. I don't know if that's what you've been thinking all along, but it makes a lot of sense. They are quite different. You know, they have much different characteristics in each of those areas.
Right, and opportunity. That's kind of where I keep coming back to, you know, the innovation district in particular is such an opportunity to do something creative and innovative. The others are more kind of fine tuning what the ordinance currently provides there. One dialing it up, one dialing it back a little bit.
Good. Good. Anything else on this discussion? Any last comments from anybody or from David or Megan?
I've talked enough.
All right. Good. Really good discussion. Thank you, David. Thank you, Megan, for bringing this to us. We'll close that item and move on to item 6, which is commissioner items. Our next meeting is Tuesday, November 9th. And if I understand, this is the one that we want to try and all be in person for, so we could actually see each other face to face.
That's great. You all will get to see this room in 3D instead of just watching me be awkwardly zooming in and out on the screen.
Thought it was in contours.
No, it'll be in this room. This is the Busher Conference Room.
The Sharon Busher Conference Room.
Good.
Used
Any
to be
other?
Megan's office, actually.
I hope Sharon Busher comes.
I would guess that we'll see Sharon Busher.
Any other commissioner items?
The only thing I was just gonna share with the rest of the commission is that the executive committee is planning to have an executive committee meeting immediately prior to the in-person meeting on November 9th. So if anybody is interested in joining, don't feel obligated, but that will be happening at 5:15.
Good, thank you. All right, item 7 is minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications?
I'll make that motion to
All right.
accept the minutes and approve the communications, or the other way around.
The other way around, that's good. Motion by Alex, is there a second? Seconded by Bryn. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, say aye, raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? That passes, and item 8 is adjournment. We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Michael, and I think that was Eves I heard, second.
Correct.
All
Yep.
those in favor of the motion to adjourn, say aye, raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Thank you all very